Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar this afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Siegel, and I'm a policy analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I know I've connected with all of you by now, and I'm looking forward to our continued work together over the next 12 months or so. But before turning to the content of today's presentation, I just wanted to walk through a couple of house cleaning items with you about how the webinar is going to work, and then take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about the National Reentry Resource Center and the Justice Center's youth program, which we spoke a bit about on last month's webinar. So any time during this presentation, you can ask a question by typing it into the QA panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We'll keep a running list of the content-related questions that we get, and then we'll ask all panelists to respond to the questions during the last segment of the webinar. And we'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you should encounter any technical or audio problems during the webinar, please call WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. And please note that there are some technical issues we may not be able to resolve, but for this reason, we're going to be recording this event, and we'll post it on our website within the next week or two. So you should see a recording of that webinar, and we'll also email you a link to the recording itself. So as we mentioned in last month's introductory webinar in partnership with OJJDP, the Council of State Governments Justice Center is a national nonprofit that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels from all branches of government. We provide practical, nonpartisan advice and consensus-driven strategies informed by available evidence to increase public safety and strengthen communities. The Second Chance Act, which was signed into law in 2008, is the first federal legislation passed by Congress to authorize federal support for reentry programs. The bill authorized up to $165 million in federal grants to state, local, and tribal government agencies and nonprofit organizations. In 2009, following a competitive process, the CSG Justice Center was selected to launch the National Reentry Resource Center and provide training and technical assistance to all other Second Chance Act grantees. The NRRC is administered by the Council of State Governments Justice Center in partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, U.S. Department of Justice. So separate from the Department of Justice and similar to grantees, we applied for funding from BJA to provide technical assistance and to work on projects with Second Chance Act grantees. Since 2009, nearly 600 Second Chance Act grant awards have been made to government agencies and nonprofit organizations from 49 states for reentry programs serving adults and juveniles. As we displayed in the graph in last month's webinar, approximately 20% of these grants were awarded to agencies and organizations serving the juvenile justice population. And the Justice Center is constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. So you can sign up for our newsletter at www.csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. This past year, with the publication and new work we've been doing in our juvenile justice portfolio, we revamped our youth page on our website to reflect our recent work and what's happening in the field. So on our website, you'll find the juvenile reentry page, which provides the most current information and resources on what works to improve youth reentry and overall juvenile justice outcomes. And you'll also find resources from key leaders in the juvenile justice field, like the MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change, and the Casey Foundation, others. The Justice Center's youth program in general provides state and local policymakers comprehensive research, analysis and technical assistance that support collaborative and consensus-based strategies that reduce recidivism, improve school discipline practices, and incorporate the available appropriate behavioral health interventions for youth and their families. Within the Justice Center's youth program, there are two main areas of focus. We have the School Discipline Consensus Project and the Juvenile Justice Project. The Juvenile Justice Project is focusing on helping state and local governments to protect public safety and help youth who are involved with the juvenile justice system become law-abiding and productive adults. And so you can learn about our work on the Juvenile Justice Project page. And you can also learn about some of our juvenile justice-related activities and access some seminal publications and resources from the field, which we drew upon heavily in the development of the planning and implementation guide that we'll be discussing today. And then the School Discipline Project is a national initiative to provide policy recommendations for supporting schools that are working to address the impact of suspension and expulsion on students' academic outcomes and involvement with the juvenile justice system. So in this webinar today, we'll start off by discussing the goals and key components of this new grant program, and then outline the purpose of the planning and implementation guide and how to make the best use of the guide for developing a strategic plan that promotes a comprehensive system-wide reentry reform aimed at improving youth reentry outcomes. We'll then take a deeper dive into each section of the guide, addressing key areas you should consider as you complete the guide with your task force. We'll then hear from A.J. Sabri from Georgia's Department of Juvenile Justice. Georgia DJJ is one of the 4 2013 Second Chance Act planning grantees, and we'll learn how DJJ's Office of Reentry Services approached the strategic planning process and how it utilized the guide as a tool for informing its efforts in this regard. And then we'll review some key next steps so that you're all clear on the expectations over the next few months and how we at the National Reentry Resource Center can support you in your work. And finally, we'll address some common questions we've received from grantees in the past about the guide and answer any questions you may have at that time. So with that, I'll now turn the next portion of this presentation over to Josh Weber, who is the director of our Juvenile Justice Program at CSG Justice Center, and he'll provide an overview of the Juvenile Reentry System Reform Grant Program. Thanks, Josh.
Liz, thank you, Liz, and thank you to everyone participating in the webinar for joining us this afternoon. First, before starting, I want to say how excited we are about this grant opportunity and the partnership with all of you to help really reform your reentry policies and practices. As Liz mentioned, and as many of you may already know, this is really a new grant program for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and it's come out of a desire to really move beyond just helping states and counties to make important but relatively small improvements to their reentry services or their reentry supervision, and really trying to help states and counties rethink their reentry process overall and how to make key jurisdiction-wide changes that can reduce recidivism and improve other youth outcomes. And so you are a first and hopefully successful cohort to be able to demonstrate the value of that systems reform approach. And we, through the National Reentry Resource Center, are able to provide you with much more intensive technical assistance and really be a partner with you in this effort in ways that we haven't been able to do with past grantees. Focusing on some of those larger goals of this grant program, as I mentioned, it really is about reentry reform writ large. And so in the past, many grantees have used the resources offered through the Second Chance Act to increase or improve their service delivery. And that can be part of the goal of this grant program, but really it's designed to rethink and develop and identify and implement systemic changes to your reentry process, and to do that not with just one facility or a small population of youth, but to think about how to do that statewide or countywide to impact all of the youth who are returning from residential facilities. So that is really a key goal of this grant program, and we're excited to work with you through that systems reform lens. As part of that process, another key aspect of this grant program is getting the support and the buy-in and the leadership of multiple branches of government and key stakeholders to really be a part of this change process. Our experience across states is, to the extent that the highest levels of government officials are aware of, informed, and helping to support the work that you're doing, it's likely to be more successful and lead to more systemic change. And so we'll be looking to work with all of you to identify who those key change agents and leaders are and how we can help you to ensure that they're at the table and supporting your efforts. This 12-month planning process has some specific deliverables associated with it, which we'll talk about in a minute. The core of those deliverables is really the development of a reentry strategic plan to reduce recidivism for high-risk youth. And so at the end of the planning process, what we should have done if we have been successful is really having a plan that outlines both short-term opportunities as well as long-term strategies for improving your reentry process that can result in significant recidivism reductions as well as improvements in other key youth outcomes. As part of that process, we'll be looking to work with you not simply to put a reentry task force together and to partner with leaders across branches of government in a short-term way, but to really use that infrastructure to establish a much more coordinated and collaborative approach across both service systems and branches of government to promote reentry reforms. Oftentimes we see that it's only one government agency or one branch of government that is leading reentry efforts, and given the challenges that reentry poses, we find that it's really multiple service systems, the behavioral health system, the child welfare system, the healthcare system, the education system that are really critical to this kind of effort success, as well as having judges, legislators, and executive level staff all participating and working to identify key reforms. And finally, another key goal of this planning process is, of course, to ultimately determine how that reentry strategic plan will be operationalized into practice. And our hope is to work with you, regardless of whether you receive implementation funding, to be able to develop an action plan for how the strategies that you identify will be implemented, and have a plan in place to actually measure the progress and the impact of those strategies on recidivism and other youth outcomes, and make changes that will really lead to sustainable improvements over time. Want to provide some examples of the kind of reentry policy and practice reforms that we in OJJDP hope come out of this grant process. We recognize that all of you have already identified some initial priorities in your grant proposals, but are hoping that a significant part of this process is us working with you to conduct a further assessment and analysis of your system and identify opportunities for broader systems reform. The kinds of examples of the reentry policy and practice changes that we've worked with other jurisdictions to support and that we hope come out of this grant process include things like using risk assessments in a much more consistent way to measure treatment progress in facilities, reduce lengths of stay, and to develop reentry plans that are matched to youth risks and needs. Revamping the service model that facilities use. Often we find facilities may not have any service model at all, or to the extent that they have one, not necessarily focused on what research suggests works to reduce recidivism. And so looking across facilities to develop a more evidence-based treatment model, as well as a more developmentally appropriate approach for staff on how they engage with youth and how they work with them to manage their behavior and promote positive behavior change. Establishing improved quality assurance protocols so that your state or county is in a position to actually assess the quality of the both secure as well as private residential placements that youth are placed in, and to begin to use the results of those assessments to really determine where youth are placed, who receives funding, and what the contractual requirements are for providers in order to offer effective services. Another example is that we see many states and counties using residential step-downs for youth leaving secure facilities and having an absence of really in-home intensive evidence-based services to support youth successful reentry back to the community. And so thinking about how you can prioritize youth once they leave a facility returning back home, and how a service system and infrastructure can be developed to support them reintegrating back into their communities and families. Developing and formalizing a cross-systems approach to assessing and addressing youth mental health and substance use treatment needs. A theme that we hear from many providers and many states is that youth mental health and substance use treatment needs are not appropriately assessed. Many youth are being placed in facilities that are not equipped to address those needs, and that states struggle with a continuity of care when youth go back into their communities. And so thinking about how to work with the behavioral health system, how to work with the healthcare financing system to potentially make changes to the way Medicaid is funded and the kind of programs and supports that Medicaid funds, to think about how to create that system of care that will support youth reentry needs. And then as a last example, establishing a new parole or probation supervision model. And so when youth are reentering back into the community, is parole and probation simply focused on surveillance and monitoring? Are revocation rates and technical violation rates a significant issue? And is there an opportunity to really rethink how youth are supervised in the community, how your agency responds to youth behavior in a graduated way, and how those probation or parole officers are trained and equipped to really help youth to successfully reintegrate back into their community. In terms of the logistics of the grant award that support this process, as you all know, this is a 12-month planning process. As we'll talk about in a bit, the proposal, your implementation proposal to OJJDP will need to likely be submitted sometime in the summer, in June or July. And so we'll have a lot of work to do to lead up to that implementation proposal submission, but you will still have the 2 months of August and September until the end of the fiscal year to complete and receive our support with all of your planning phase activities. The resources that you have during this planning phase are really to make sure that you have the right folks at the table, that they're actively engaged in the planning process, that you develop the infrastructure, if it does not already exist, to be able to track recidivism and other youth outcomes throughout the implementation phase, and that you establish partnerships as needed to be able to support that process. The planning phase is built around these specific deliverables, and as I mentioned, you will receive intensive support from the National Reentry Resource Center to really help you accomplish those deliverables, but really going above and beyond those deliverables. It's really going to be up to you use us in whatever manner is most effective. We'll provide some examples of ways that we can provide technical assistance, but we really see ourselves and are looking forward to being more than just a distance technical assistance provider with you in this process. We really want to be a partner to understand your system, understand what the challenges are, and really help you get the buy-in, support, and identify the resources and strategies you need to be able to be more successful. And then finally, as mentioned, this planning process will culminate in an implementation proposal to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention for up to $2 million to implement the strategic plans that you develop during this process. I want to emphasize that that is a competitive process. So it is very unlikely that OJJDP will be able to or necessarily want to fund all of the planning grantees. And so while we certainly don't want to create an atmosphere where grantees are directly competing with each other, the reality is it's grantees' ability to really demonstrate success on all of the planning phase deliverables and to put implementation proposals in place that are really proposing significant jurisdiction-wide reforms to the reentry process and have the buy-in and leadership at the highest levels of government that are going to be much more likely to receive that significant implementation funding. There are 4 key deliverables of the planning phase. The first deliverable, which many of you may have already in place in some form or fashion, is a reentry task force. And that task force, as noted, should have leadership across branches of government and service systems that can really help identify your priority reentry challenges, what the improvement needs are, and what will be needed across those branches of government and service systems to really advance policy and practice changes. We've seen states and counties take 2 very different approaches to these reentry task forces. In some cases, they're put together really for the purposes of complying with the grant requirements, and they don't prove to be really useful bodies, and instead places that people are just going to and having additional meetings. And in other states, we see states really use those reentry task forces as an opportunity to bring leaders together, get everyone to establish a shared vision of what's important for the juvenile justice system, and work together to advance needed improvements. And we're hoping all of you will be following along those lines. The second key deliverable is developing a plan and the capacity to really track recidivism and other youth outcomes so you can measure the progress of the improvements that you will hopefully make through this process, and that you're doing more than just collecting that data, but really able to analyze it, share it with key stakeholders, and use it to guide policy, practice, and resource allocation decisions on an ongoing basis. We realize that for many states and many systems, this data collection is a real challenge, but we have an entire research division at the National Reentry Resource Center, and we have experts on staff that can really help you think through both the specific research and data questions as well as the technology questions that you may need to tackle to be in a position to be able to collect that data. The third key deliverable is the development of a comprehensive jurisdiction-wide reentry strategic plan. As part of that deliverable, we will be helping to facilitate you to assess your barriers and your gaps in terms of your existing policies and practices, and to what extent they align with what research has definitively shown works to reduce recidivism for high-risk youth. And so you'll have support and guidance from us both to facilitate your existing system as well as to help you develop a reentry strategic plan to address the challenges that come out of that assessment. And then finally, the culminating deliverable of the planning program is a plan to implement your strategic plan. In the time allowed, to the extent possible, we'll want to work with you to get as specific as possible about what that action plan looks like. And so what are the key tasks, who are the staff, what are the real resources that are required, and what are realistic timelines needed to address areas of improvement and effectively implement and sustain reentry reforms. As you may have noted in the Planning and Implementation Guide, each of these deliverables has a timeline associated with it. And the timelines are fixed, as we'll talk about in a minute, to specific exercises within the Planning and Implementation Guide that we ask all of you to complete and submit to us for review. But those exercises, what's important about them is not just the completion of them, but of course the substance behind each of those. And so while we don't necessarily expect that by the end of February you'll have a fully formed and completely effective reentry task force, and you'll have worked out all of the details around how you'll track recidivism and other youth outcomes, our expectation is that we'll be working with you in an intensive way as needed over the next few months to think through all of the challenges to putting that task force together and maximizing its utility, to tracking recidivism and other outcome improvements, and to beginning to address those challenges and having a plan in place and specific action steps needed throughout the rest of the planning phase so that you are well positioned by the end of it to have those structures in place. Similarly, with your reentry strategic plan, by the end of April, the expectation is not necessarily that you have a 50 or 100-page reentry strategic plan developed, but that you've gone through an assessment process with us. That assessment process has gotten significant input from key stakeholders at all levels of your agency as well as your partners, that it's identified key challenges that you may have already identified in your proposed scope of work, but additional challenges that have come out of that assessment process, and that you've established in partnership with your reentry task force some specific strategies to address those. And then finally, at the end of June, we'll be working with you around the next steps to then take that reentry strategic plan and think through an implementation and action plan for moving those strategies forward. The development of that implementation and sustainability plan will then position you to apply for the implementation solicitation that OJJDP will release for the implementation phase sometime in July. With that, I will shift things back to Liz.
Thanks, Josh. So let's turn our attention now to the guide itself. And I'll walk through with you the purpose of that guide and how to go about completing it in a thoughtful, comprehensive way. So while the P&I guide is a requirement under the OJJDP's solicitation program, we really want this guide to serve as a roadmap that helps you develop this comprehensive system-wide reentry strategy, and also, as Josh mentioned, an implementation plan that helps you operationalize the reentry reform improvement needs that you identify throughout the process. So with that, it's not sort of a one-time tool for you. We see this as a resource for you and your task force to be able to continuously assess your reentry policies and practices over time, to continue identifying strengths and gaps as you move through this process, and then ultimately improving your work in this regard and making this something that's institutionalized, something that's ingrained in your jurisdiction, and something that is sustainable over time. The guide will also serve as a foundation for the technical assistance that you receive from us at the National Reentry Resource Center. So your TA provider, which will be myself and the team here, will work with you and your task force closely through each section of this guide as you complete the corresponding exercises and develop your juvenile reentry strategic plan. And ultimately, as you're positioning yourself to compete for implementation funding. As your TA provider, at the National Reentry Resource Center will also be using the results of these exercises in each of the sections to really help you identify areas in which our resources can be most helpful for you in assisting you to accomplish the planning deliverables and be successful. So in completing the guide, you'll want to work closely with your reentry task force and other key stakeholders to complete each of the exercises. Here at the NRRC, we'll support you in this process through reviewing and helping to diagnose your results and providing guidance along the way as you develop an action plan and associated implementation proposal for OJJDP. Completion of the guide is going to be an ongoing phased process, as we spoke about, and so we're not asking grantees to complete this guide all at once. You know, the overarching goal of completing these exercises in this guide is to really conduct an honest, thoughtful assessment of your system's strengths and weaknesses, and to ultimately identify areas for improvement to guide the development of your strategic plan and establish the structures and supports that will really promote sustainable reentry reforms. And so the goal for completing exercises is not going through them simply because they're required. Really, we ask you to be open and transparent in your self-assessment of some of the challenges and needs. Your task force should work together, as I said, to complete all the exercises as opposed to one single person filling them out. It really is a collaborative. We also encourage you to draw upon input from external stakeholders if that's something that would be helpful for you. And we also ask you, as Josh mentioned, to really be proactive and engaging with the National Reentry Resource Center on an ongoing basis, in addition to the biweekly calls and the on-site support that we'll provide. It really is what you make of it, and if we don't have the answers here, we are connected to a wide variety of experts in the field and other organizations who are working on comprehensive juvenile justice reform. As a JSR grantee, you should expect and plan for about 1 to 2 site visits from the National Reentry Resource Center to support the completion of the guide and each of the deliverables in the guide. And again, while I'll schedule formal calls with you all, please don't hesitate to reach out before that time with any questions or if challenges arise. As Josh mentioned, we see our technical assistance as an ongoing partnership. And as we said earlier, ultimately completion of the guide is going to culminate in this action plan and implementation proposal to OJJDP. As you'll see in the guide, the action plan really spells out the key tasks that are required to address some of the priority improvement needs. It'll identify the key staff responsible for completing those tasks, the resources, you know, the timelines for completing those tasks. So it'll be a real detailed way of saying how you're going to be operationalizing these identified policy and practice reforms. So we've touched upon some of the types of technical assistance available through the NRRC to help JSR planning grantees complete the planning deliverables. But in addition to working with me as your TA provider, you'll also have access to a broader pool of expert consultants through the National Reentry Resource Center. And just to drill down on some of the specifics of what TA might look like in practice, and what we've done, some of what we've done for grantees in the past. I'm breaking this down into a few concrete activities. The first is facilitating strategic planning sessions or meetings of reentry task forces. So if you'd like us to come out to one of your monthly or biweekly task force meetings to do this, we can talk about what an agenda would look like and what the objective and goals of our participation would be in our meeting with the task force. We can conduct presentations on the JSR program itself to the task force, to agency staff, to state and county leadership, and also provide trainings on what works to improve reentry outcomes to the task force and other leaders. Some examples of trainings we've provided and through our TA in the past have included trainings on family engagement, trainings on risk-need responsivity framework, working with systems around, their cross-systems collaboration practices. So we really can be flexible in what we provide, as long as it fits within your goals for this project and helps you meet your deliverables and requirements in the grant program. Another key area we'll be partnering with our research division, as Josh mentioned. They're located in Austin, and they'll be helping you to identify some baseline recidivism rates, helping to set goals for your system, and help to develop plans for tracking improvements in your work. And you'll find more information on this data piece in Section 2, Deliverable 2, the Planning Implementation Guide, so they'll be engaged in that process. We'll also be available to help facilitate policy practice assessments and diagnosis of assessment results. So as you're walking through and completing exercises, helping you work through what those priority improvement areas need, where those assessment results derive from. We can make ourselves available for that. Translating assessment findings into proposed policy and practice improvements and implementation plans. What does that mean? How do you operationalize that in practice? Another key area is where we can connect you with additional research and examples of best practices from across the country, and also peer learning partners to support reentry reform efforts. As the Justice Center works under a national umbrella, we have insight and access to the work happening across the country, and so grantees often appreciate getting connected with their peers in the field, hearing what's happening outside of their state or local jurisdiction and learning from each other. So to give you an example of what this might look like in practice, this January we'll be bringing together all of the FY13 Second Chance Act co-occurring juvenile grantees through a conference call to share best practices around serving youth with mental health and substance use disorders. So we can conduct similar calls and opportunities with you all. We also can help facilitate peer learning site visits and peer-to-peer phone calls, so that opportunity can be made available. So I'll now turn the next segment of this presentation over to Josh, who'll walk us through each section of the guide and walk through some of those key deliverables. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Liz. So as noted, there are 4 key deliverables for the planning phase. The first deliverable, again, which hopefully most of you have in place to some extent already, is establishing a comprehensive and effective reentry task force. As mentioned earlier, those reentry task forces can really serve as an incredibly useful vehicle to get key system stakeholders on the same page, to establish a coordinated approach across systems and branches of government for improving reentry outcomes and for developing and overseeing your reentry strategic plan and ensuring the resources and the support exist to ensure that plan can be implemented effectively. So the first key deliverable that we will be working with you on is putting this task force together. And based on our experience working with over 600 jurisdictions, almost all of whom were required to also have a reentry task force, we've identified some key elements that are described in more detail in the Planning and Implementation Guide that we've found across those different states and counties are really, really critical to maximizing the effectiveness of that reentry task force. And so we'll just briefly discuss those today, as we will with the other deliverables, but then really look forward to engaging with all of you in the coming months to get a better sense of where you are around each of these deliverables and these key elements, and how we can work with you to make sure that you have this infrastructure in place. And so what we found in terms of an effective reentry task force is there's 5 critical elements. The first is having comprehensive membership. And so it's being really thoughtful and careful about who the people are who are on your reentry task force, and making sure that you have representatives from the key branches of government as well as the key service systems that are really going to be needed to support the kinds of system reform changes that you're looking for. And so, for example, if one of your key priorities is improving mental health and substance use treatment in facilities, improving the availability and the quality of those services when youth return to the community, and ensuring that there is a sufficient and sustainable funding mechanism in place for those services, then it will be critical that your reentry task force has high-level leadership from your mental health and substance use agencies, from your healthcare financing agencies, potentially large providers that provide those services. And so thinking carefully about the kind of changes that you'll need to make, and who are the members that will need to be on that task force to support your implementation of those changes. The second key element that we find of effective reentry task forces is not just having that comprehensive and inclusive membership, but also carefully selecting who those representatives are and making sure that they're folks that have decision-making authority. And so again, the goal of this reentry task force is not simply to be a place or a forum for discussion, but is really to develop and implement plans and to make changes to policy and practice. And in order for that to happen, one of the consistent challenges that we see with many reentry task forces is they don't have the decision makers at the table who need to authorize needed changes, memorandums of understanding, new ways of doing business, and ensuring that staff across agencies are really held accountable for implementing reforms. And so making sure that you have those decision makers at the table, and again, we see part of our role in this process is helping you engage with those folks and encourage their participation. A third key element is having a clear structure and goals for the task force. And so that's sometimes as simple as making sure that you have regular meetings, that those meetings are established far enough advance to make sure you can get those decision makers at the table, that there are clear goals for what this task force is doing, that it's very much focused on the deliverables of this planning phase and the ultimate reforms that you're looking to make. What we often see for reentry task forces that can be helpful is having the task force have a core executive committee that's really made up of those higher level decision makers, and then having subcommittees or subgroups that are focused on specific aspects of improving the reentry process that do the more hands-on work of developing those strategies and then providing plans to that executive committee to review and to ultimately improve. And so there are a number of different ways to organize the task force, but the most important goal in thinking about the structure and the membership is how to organize the task force in a way that really uses it to identify what needs to improve and to help oversee and get the buy-in needed to make those improvements. As part of that process, having clear roles and responsibilities for members is very important. And so what we see a number of task force do is actually have vision statements and mission statements and have policies and procedures and have specific memorandums of understanding or agreement that all members sign on to that really lay out the roles and responsibilities of participating in the task force and the expectations for their time and involvement. You know, every state and every system works differently, but sometimes we find that formalizing people's involvement in the task force in that way helps to ensure that it is taken more seriously, and folks realize that, that this effort is really about larger policy change. And then finally, having the staff and other resources to support the sustainability of these task forces. And so what we found incredibly helpful in other sites is actually having a staff member who is administratively responsible for organizing these task force meetings, for making sure that meetings are scheduled and that the folks that need to come to the table are engaged and have the information and the materials and resources they need to use those meetings productively, to capture key next steps from those meetings and share those with the group, resources to support making sure that folks can have a meeting space and call in, or video conferencing technology. So a lot of the little logistics and staff support, but we see that that makes a huge difference in having more effective reentry task forces. The second key deliverable is having a plan and really building the capacity, if it doesn't exist, to track recidivism and other youth outcome improvements that are going to result from this grant, but at a larger level, that you have that capacity in place in an ongoing way to measure the impact of your reentry efforts overall. And again, there are a number of key elements to doing that successfully. And so the first is having a specific target population that you're going to focus on for this, this grant effort. And then that target population really should be, to the extent feasible, focusing on the highest risk youth in your system, or the youth who are recidivating at the highest level, and really targeting them and establishing plans to reduce their recidivism rates. The second is having a process, as well as the electronic infrastructure in place, to track the different ways that youth can come into contact with the justice system. And so we see many systems that may be tracking re-adjudication rates, but aren't tracking reincarceration rates, or aren't tracking youth involvement into the adult correction system, or aren't tracking technical violation rates. And so they have a sort of limited purview into to what extent they're being successful, and whether youth are really recidivating over the long term. And so one of the ways that we'll work with you is to identify how you're currently tracking recidivism, whether you're able to follow and track youth in all of those different ways described, what are the technology barriers and system barriers to being able to do that kind of tracking, and how can we work with you to really address those barriers. The third key element is not just focusing on recidivism, and we know it's a challenge for many places to even measure recidivism accurately and comprehensively, and maybe even more of a challenge to measure positive youth outcomes like academic progress and degree attainment and vocational certification and employment and behavioral health outcomes and child welfare outcomes. And the Second Chance Act is very focused on recidivism, but we want to encourage you to also identify and prioritize a limited set of positive youth outcomes, and for us to think with you about how you can track those outcomes as well. A next key element of tracking these outcomes is really establishing baselines, particularly baseline recidivism rates for the target population that you're looking to serve, and identify specific quantifiable targets for improvement for both your target population and for your population overall. We can really work with you and engage with our research division to engage with your research or IT staff, if you have them, to try to look at your data and how these baseline rates can be established. These are not just numbers that we want to pick out of a hat, but really work with you to take a look at your existing data. We can even help you analyze that data and help identify where you are now and to set some realistic targets for improvement. Next is we want to explore with you to what extent you are able to analyze those recidivism rates and other outcomes by key youth characteristics as well as system variables. The most important one that stands out is risk level. And so are you able to accurately assess youth's risk to reoffend? And are you tracking recidivism when youth return back to the community by whether they're low, moderate, or high risk, so that you can determine actual recidivism rates compared to expected recidivism rates based on youth's predicted risk to reoffend. We'll also want to work with you to analyze to what extent you can track recidivism by different geographic locations where youth are coming from, as well as demographic variables, recidivism by different facilities, recidivism by participation in different residential or community service programs. That kind of analysis to really dig beneath general numbers, understand areas of strength as well as poor performance, and really use that data to identify what needs to improve. And again, recognizing for many of you, you may not have this capacity. There may be resource or other barriers to developing it, but we'll want to think with you about what's possible, where partnerships can be developed to address some of these issues, because it will be critical for grantees that want to be positioned for the implementation phase to really have the capacity in place to measure the impact of those significant dollars on recidivism in all of these very different ways. Next, it's important that that data is not an end in of itself, but really the ultimate goal of collecting that data is to share it with your staff at all levels within your agency, with the Reentry Task Force, with the government officials and policymakers that hopefully are supporting your reform efforts, and ultimately that data is used to inform and continuously improve reentry policy practice and resource allocation. And so thinking through what is the current process in place to really track those outcomes, to share them, and to formally review them with decision makers, and to use that data to identify improvements. And to the extent that those processes don't exist, we can think with you and we can show you other models for how systems have really used that data in an ongoing way to really refine and improve their reentry supervision and services. The next deliverable is the development of the comprehensive system-wide reentry strategic plan. We're going to offer you a potential template for what that reentry strategic plan should include and address. As Liz mentioned, we've really spent the last year reviewing all of the rigorous research that's been conducted on what works to reduce recidivism and improve other outcomes for youth in the juvenile justice system, particularly the kind of higher risk youth that all of you are serving. In July of this year, we produced a white paper, 100-page long white paper, but also with an executive summary that really details and synthesizes that research to focus on a set of core principles, which are shown here, that research has shown really are critical to getting better reentry outcomes, and also provides a wealth of information on how to implement those recommendations and these principles in practice. And so what is contained in the planning and implementation guide is really a self-assessment to really identify to what extent your current policies and practices align with these principles and the specific recommendations underneath them. The first principle really focused on to what extent your agency is using validated risk and need assessments to make supervision and service decisions throughout the reentry process. So the decision to determine where youth are placed, how they're classified, how long they stay, how treatment progress is objectively measured, what sort of supervision and services youth need when they go back to the community, So one big area that we'll be working with you on to assess, and also a potential area for reform, is to what extent risk and needs assessments are really driving all of those key reentry decisions. The second principle is about adopting and, importantly, effectively implementing with fidelity those interventions that have been demonstrated by research to reduce recidivism, and also having the data at both a quality assurance level and a case outcome level to evaluate whether those services are being implemented effectively. And so that includes both the services that are being offered to youth in residential facilities, as well as the services that support their successful reentry. So again, a key issue that we'll be working with you on to examine and identify areas for improvement. The third core principle that we established is really having a coordinated approach across service systems to address youth needs. And your reentry task force, again, will be critical to helping you to do that. As I'm sure you all know, research has shown that a significant proportion of youth in facilities have mental health treatment needs, have substance use treatment needs, often co-occurring disorders. Up to 2/3 of youth in the juvenile justice system have past or current child welfare involvement. Significant educational issues for many of the youth in the juvenile justice system. And so your ability to both coordinate with the different service systems for youth while they're in residential placement, but then in particular to address their educational needs and their behavioral health needs when they return back to the community, research shows will be critical to reducing recidivism and improving other youth outcomes. And then the fourth core principle is around having a developmentally appropriate approach to both system policies, programs, as well as supervision and services. And so again, looking at to what extent facilities have a philosophy that's really focused on understanding and promoting adolescent development and positive youth outcomes, that staff are trained to engage youth and to work with them in an appropriate fashion, that supervision both in facilities and in communities are really focused on promoting positive behavior change and not just compliance and punishment. Those are all the sorts of issues that we'll be exploring with you and that we'll hope will be addressed in your reentry strategic plan. And then finally, the fourth deliverable is then taking that reentry plan and at least beginning to develop an implementation and sustainability plan to advance those areas for improvement during the implementation phase, but hopefully committing to addressing those improvement needs even if you don't receive implementation funding. And so some key factors of those sustainability plans that we hope to be working with you on include a process for ongoing stakeholder engagement and leadership support, having a thoughtful plan in place for how staff at your agency really buy into the reforms that you're proposing and are trained and supported to be able to eventually implement them effectively, how your task force and your agency is really going to oversee these reform efforts and make sure stakeholders are held accountable for results. And then, of course, that resources are identified, again, regardless of OJJDP funding, or even if you do receive OJJDP funding, that there's a plan in place to continue to support whatever changes are needed over the long term. Liz, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, Josh. So now that we've had the opportunity to provide an overview of the grant program and walk through the different sections of the guide, as I mentioned earlier, we'd like for you to hear from a grantee who went through this process, this reentry strategic planning process, completed a planning and implementation guide, and used the guide to really inform their state's strategic planning efforts. So while the FY13 guide was revamped this year to reflect the new grant program, the strategies that Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice employs to really maximize the potential of this guide, and uses of the guide are certainly relevant to everyone on this call. So with that, we have joining us AJ Sabri, who is the Strategic Planning and Implementation Manager for the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice. Georgia DJJ, as I said, was one of the was a 2013 planning grantee, and the agency also went through a 12-month planning process similar to the JSR program structure. DJJ is also one of the current FY14 Second Chance Act two-phase planning and implementation demonstration grantees. So AJ, thanks for joining us today. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions for AJ about his experience during his presentation, please type your question to the box at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and I'll hand it over to you, AJ. Thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks for allowing me this opportunity, and I look forward to this opportunity for our implementation grant, but also wish everyone the best of success in your planning process. What I want to start out with is just talking about how we, at the very beginning, made sure that our process was connected with the planning and implementation guide. We made sure that, and other slides will be. We wanted to make sure that we consulted with our national reentry experts, and in Georgia we used Dr. Mark Lipsey, Dr. David Offschuler, and through the National Reentry Resource Council, we used Dr. Shea Belichick. And we also made sure we consulted with diverse groups of additional stakeholders. And through that process, we developed our statewide task force. And we also had an internal work group that did a large amount of work in terms of the development of our strategic plan. And as we went through this process, we made sure we stayed connected and that it was a guide for shaping a system-wide reentry strategy, an integrated set of policy and implementation expectations that promote improved youth reentry outcomes. And it was also used as a tool for assessing the comprehensive evidence-based nature of reentry policies and practices to identify strengths and gaps. And we also made sure it was a strategy for developing a shared understanding that we got buy-in from different agencies, different sections within our department, and we looked at accountability across key stakeholders for the activities that support improved youth reentry outcomes. Today, the purpose that we really want to look at is to present an overview of the planning process and the method we use in developing our Georgia Department of Juvenile Reentry Offender Reentry Framework Strategic Plan. And we had a work group of various members who worked in that process. And we always made sure that we kept focus on the end state was to have a measurable positive impact on our youth to successfully transition and reintegrate back into our communities to reduce recidivism. And also we took on a mantra to offer hope and youth change. One thing that I think is very key in this process is that for us to have support at the very highest level, executive leadership, our state was going through a period where we were looking at criminal justice reform. And so there were a set of mandates from the legislative body as well as the executive branch in terms of reentry reform in our state. And our governor, Governor Nathan Deal, made offender reentry part of his strategic goal and plan in terms of state initiative. And it was also initiated by our Commissioner Avery D. Niles to initiate this process in FY13 in order to support what the governor's office was doing. I mention that because it's important that as you look at through this process that you connect it with and keep it connected with the different levels of your state as you move through this process, and also make sure you connect it and review it and make sure it also supports your agency's vision, mission, goals, and objectives as you follow this process. We, as we looked at developing our strategic plan, we wanted to satisfy not just some mandates we had in the state and the P&I guide and the things that we needed to be doing as a Department of Juvenile Justice. And one of the things we looked at was the transition from prison to community initiative framework. And at the heart of our initiative in Georgia was the Georgia Prison Reentry Initiative framework that was designed to build approaches for reentry improvement developed by the National Prisoner Reentry Council. And it was outlined in the Reentry Policy Council report and the National Institute of Correction through the transition from prison to community initiative framework. And this approach provides some guidance for us for specific justice policies that were considered in Georgia as targets for change to improve prisoner reentry. And as part of the P&I guide for FY13, it also outlined those 3 phases and 7 decision points and targets for change in terms of looking at the getting ready phase, the institutional phase, the going home phase, the pre-release phase, the staying home phase, and the community supervision and discharge phase as 7 primary decision points that comprise our reentry policy. In December, we launched the development of our strategic plan, and basically with the support of executive leadership, we looked at that Georgia PRI plan and converted it into juvenile justice language. We brought together on a weekly basis a group of internal work groups that went through that plan line for line and made sure that what we were putting in our strategic plan was sensitive to juvenile justice language, as well as making sure it was meeting the deliverable system-wide reentry strategic plan as outlined in the P&I guide, making sure that we would address the validated risk and needs assessment, programs and services demonstrated to reduce recidivism. How do we use outcome and the use of data to evaluate the results? How do we employ those coordinated approaches across service systems to address the youth needs? And also making sure that we tailor these policies, programs, and supervision to reflect the distinct developmental needs of adolescents. Representatives were assigned to participate in our reentry strategic plan work group from all sections throughout our department. And these meetings were co-facilitated based on subject matter experts in the areas we were discussing, engaging an extensive range of subject matter experts to review and develop the strategic plan. And it was an opportunity for us to really come together as an agency and really have robust discussion in terms of understanding what each section in our department was doing as we developed this plan, but also to start communicating and seeing the connectedness in terms of what each one of us was doing and had an impact on the other section. The work group met weekly over a 3-month period discussing those 7 decision points, which included 27 targets for change. And the work group went line by line, identifying each policy expectation and operational performance expectation as either an asset or barrier. Each decision point was linked to one or more written policy, and if the committee identified one of those targets for change or things as a barrier, we would develop what was the steps needed to be taken to address these barriers and who would be responsible for addressing that. During these meetings, we had rich discussion occurring, allowing all participants an opportunity to have a robust conversation and a safe space for expressing ideas and concerns. In preparing our reentry strategic plan, the Office of Reentry Services is initiating a process where we think we have continuous strategic thinking and planning that will produce a network for our implementation plan. This plan is designed to keep pace with the changing trends related to juvenile justice research and reform, and therefore the initial plan represents for us a beginning and not an end. Because this plan is very critical to our success, we strive to involve all federal, state agencies, nonprofits, for-profit organizations, community leaders, and advocates as part of this process. The plan is designed, one of the things we want to make sure, our goal was to assure the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice is moving in the right direction by identifying key indicators for improvement, which results in changed youth, unified families, and safer communities. Without staff dedication and continuous support, our youth, we know, would not have access to thousands of programs critical to our mission to offer hope and youth change. In our process, for each barrier, we determined, as we looked at things that were barriers, we would determine who would do what and when in order to eliminate that as a barrier. And then we created a plan of action. And our next steps are to access the resources, the fiscal gaps that prevent the plan from becoming a system-wide reality, and to determine our current fiscal commitment, what the cost is, and what it will take to expand the activity system-wide. The Department of Juvenile Justice looked to determine the performance measures that we needed to put in place in reaching and achieving the changes identified in the plan, and how to include the performance measures in policy and how they can be documented. As you see in the next slide, these are the 3 phases and 7 decision points that we use, and you can and it helped us tremendously in not having to reinvent the wheel and start from the very beginning. But it gave us kind of a model and an outline in terms of as we developed our strategic plan for our agency's reentry process. In conclusion, the Department of Juvenile Justice Offender Reentry Framework Strategic Plan will be used for us as a guide to juvenile youth reentry reforms at the operational level through work groups and internal department sections collaboration. The major focus will be to continuously review the assets and barriers and develop plans of actions to enhance assets and overcome those barriers to improve collaboration, coordination, and execution through information sharing, policies, directives, performance-based measures and outcomes, and improved youth supervision. And at the very end of the day, the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice will work to implement this strategic model to fidelity so that we can offer our youth hope and youth change. In conclusion, also, this is the Office of Reentry Services headed by Keith Jones and Kathy Smith-Curry, and I appreciate the opportunity to have an opportunity to share very briefly some of the process we went through in developing our strategic plan through the implementation process.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing your experiences with the group, AJ. It was really valuable to hear the process that you undertook as an agency. Again, I encourage anyone, any participants on the call, if you have any questions for AJ about DJJ's experience or any questions about the guide itself and how DJJ used that to inform its planning process, please type that into the box at the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. Earlier in the presentation, Josh outlined some concrete deadlines for each of the deliverables in the guide. But in terms of immediate or more short-term next steps, let's first turn our attention to what's happening this month. So each of you have already connected with me by phone or email, and all of you have scheduled a call with us to review your county or state's reentry process, some of your documented policies and practices, which you sent to me, and to begin the process of identifying some of those priority improvements that will inform the development of your strategic plan. And during that call, we'll also begin talking a bit about deliverables 1 and 2, so the status of your reentry task force, and some of the current recidivism and other youth outcomes data and your capacity in that regard. In January and February, there will be several activities that will be happening in parallel. You'll be in regular contact with your reentry task force and myself and others at the NRRC to discuss the current status of your reentry strategic planning efforts. And at the same time, as Josh mentioned, you'll have access to the Justice Center's Research Division as a resource to help you with the tracking and measurement of recidivism data, developing some baseline rates, improvement target rates, and learning about some of the best practices for data measurement and analysis. And we'll work with you to talk about how you'll translate these best practices into real actionable reentry policy and practice reforms. And then you and I will schedule an initial site visit, probably around January, February, to facilitate and support the completion of deliverables 1 and 2, and really to continue movement on this project through the end of the 12-month grant period. And then at the end of February, you'll be asked to submit to me your completed P&I guide exercises, which are deliverables 1 and 2, and we'll review those results together. So we've reached the final Q&A portion of the webinar, and so just a reminder, if you have any questions, it's not too late to ask them. But before we turn to those larger questions from participants, I just wanted to address some of the common questions we've received from grantees regarding the P&I guide and the process. The first is, will OJJDP be looking at our completed P&I guides, and if so, how will they be using our responses? The quick answer to that is yes, the P&I guide is a requirement of the grant program, and OJJDP will be reviewing those guides. It's looking at those guides as evidence of having successfully completed the grant planning deliverables, but really the guide was developed in partnership with OJJDP, and so as long as you are thoughtful and thorough in walking through that together with our support, you should be good to go on that end. It's also important to keep in mind that while we'll be reviewing this guide and be sending it to OJJDP, we still encourage you to be, as I said, as honest as possible in completing those exercises, as the purpose of the guide is really to help you develop a effective and comprehensive strategic plan and position you to compete for implementation funding. And so it will really help guide you in that regard.
Liz,
yeah.
Just to add on to that, I just want to be sure that everyone's clear that the basis for evaluating who ends up receiving an implementation award is not the quality of your current juvenile justice system, or to the extent that your current outcomes or the extent to which the system already aligns with what research says works to reduce recidivism and get better outcomes. This process is not about trying to find the best juvenile justice system and providing that system with funding. Instead, it's really how seriously this planning opportunity is being taken, how thoughtful and significant the changes that are being proposed are identified, and to what extent that those changes will have a significant impact on reducing recidivism and improving outcomes for youth in your juvenile justice system, and really the leadership, the staff leadership, the staff buy-in at all levels within your agency and government that you can demonstrate that's really committed to advancing that plan. So it's not a question of where folks are now, but the plan that's put in place to get you to improve better outcomes. And so that's just another way of saying really this process, as you complete these exercises, as you work with us, is to be as honest and transparent as possible. You don't feel like you need to prove that you're doing a great job at everything, because we know that's not realistic. It's instead being able to work with us to really identify systemic opportunities for change and moving those forward that is really going to position systems best for then moving forward with that implementation phase.
Great, thanks, Josh. Another question is around, what if we can't get everyone who should complete this guide to the table in time, really looking at the task force as the driver behind this. Again, you should sort of make your best effort to invest in section 1, deliverable 1 of this process, and really building that Reentry task force to position to do that. But again, the first couple of calls with us will be helping to support your effort in this regard. And again, the Reentry task force doesn't need to be this static group that you build at this one time. Certainly as new concerns and needs come up, this can be a group that's built upon this assessment process. This guide can be a tool for you to revisit with your task force over time, and as the task force maybe changes in composition. So again, we'll talk through this, but please don't feel pressured to get this done in immediate sense. Another question is related to how and to what extent can we at NRRC assist in developing an implementation proposal. So again, in this whole process, we'll be working with you and your task force to collaboratively identify some of these priority policy and practice changes, but we, won't help write the implementation proposal or be involved in the application process. That's not our role in this. But again, this grant project and our support throughout this project will help position you to be competitive and submit a strategic plan that underwent thoughtfulness and comprehensive and effort. So I want to emphasize that. And lastly, so what is the likelihood of receiving implementation funding? And we talked about this earlier. Josh mentioned, this is a competitive grant program, and OJJDP expects to grant around sort of 2 to 3 implementation awards. So that said, implementation funding is not guaranteed. So we encourage grantees to really be comprehensive, be thoughtful, be honest in completing all of the planning deliverables, and really identifying significant opportunities for reentry reforms that are system-wide, that are ambitious, but also achievable, and that are reflected in your ultimate strategic plan. And again, this is a partnership, and we'll be supporting you in this process. So I think that's it. We didn't receive any additional questions other than those that have been addressed. but certainly we'll make ourselves available. You can email or call us at any time should questions come up after leaving this webinar. And we look forward to speaking with you over the this next month and really diving into the first phase of this project. So again, congratulations on receiving this award, and really looking forward to our work together. Once you exit the webinar, a brief survey is going to pop up on your screen. It's a brief survey. It'll only take a few minutes to complete, so if you could go ahead and do that, that would be really helpful for us, that we can sort of improve upon our efforts at the National Reentry Resource Center and how we provide these long-distance learning opportunities. And again, just a reminder to please check out our youth program page on our website at csgjusticecenter.org/youth. We have a handful of our publications and resources available for you to look at. Feel free to ask any questions if you should have them about those pages. And then, of course, to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't done so already, and be sure to type in youth as an interest. So thanks again. Thanks to Josh and AJ for participating in this call, and we wish you all the best of luck moving forward. Thank you.